Hi, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining this episode of Islamomisia. This is the first, I suppose, interview under the new trademark labeled Islamomisia. I think those of you who have read what I've written before, I believe Islamophobia is a myth, but I want to start to promote the idea of Islamomisia, namely hating Islam is the only rational thing. Anyway, I am absolutely delighted and honored to have with me one of my great heroes of the last 10 years, Mr. Aron Flam. He's a stand-up comedian, satirist, author, and podcaster supreme, and in my opinion, a Swedish equivalent of a Christopher Hitchens, if you wish, or a Douglas Murray, someone who writes exceptionally well, but more importantly than being able to be eloquent, Aaron, or Aaron, as I'm sure he prefers to be called, uh, manages to pinpoint the true nature of the evils that infect the Western societies today. And primarily, his area of focus is Sweden. So that's going to be our topic of conversation today. Aron Flam, thank you so much for joining. Is there anything I missed in that short bio that you want to bring up?
That was so much praise that if I could, I'd go red in my face. I'll try to be as eloquent in English as you suppose that I am in Swedish. We'll see how it goes.
Well, I'm very grateful for your time today. Thank you. What we'll do, everyone, just to set the stage, is I'll have a few questions for Aaron for the next 40 to 45 minutes or so, and then I will open up the floor for people to ask questions. Please use the raise your hand function in Zoom. So, Aaron, I titled this event as The Inevitable Death of Sweden. I didn't actually check with you if that's a title that you're comfortable with or if that's something that would give you cause for concern and disagreement. Just curious, do you feel that Sweden is on its way towards early death?
Well, it's your show. I'm just hitching a ride, so you may call it whatever you want. But since I'm a believer in free speech, um, yeah, well, it looks as if though Sweden is committing cultural suicide. I think if you look at Western nations or at least Western European nations, Belgium is probably in first place when it comes to committing cultural suicide, collective suicide. And France and Sweden is vying for second place. The UK coming in now at a third place, but they are really sprinting here towards the end. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I wonder what the common denominator there is, but I'm sure we'll get to that. I suppose it'll be very interesting to hear if there was a certain point. I'm sure there wasn't a single point, but a period of time where you became convinced that Sweden is going towards that direction.
Well, I was doing stand up for most of my youth, right after university. And I had promised myself that I wouldn't make jokes about men and women, the differences between men and women, not because of any PC considerations. I just thought that topic had been exhausted
Mm.
and felt a bit tired to me. So I had that as a rule for myself. But then I noticed that a lot of females, almost all female comedians actually, had very sexist jokes about men, but no male comedians seemed to be able to make jokes about women anymore. And then I came to the realization, I was young, as I tried to explain, that the relationship between the sexes is a human constant that you cannot exhaust.
Mm.
And if one party in this relationship sort of surrenders or completely leaves the battlefield, it becomes a massacre. So I started doing jokes about, the relationship between men and women, and then I noticed that the conversation had been hijacked essentially by a sub variety of socialism. I guess you call it third or fourth wave feminism, depending on where in the Western world you're at. And this was a very, very strange ideology that preached basically that there's no biological difference between men and women. So they're essentially the same. But at the same time, one is an oppressor and the other is a constant victim. One is righteous and one is inherently toxic. And when I dug into that, and I think maybe that's what got me into stand-up comedy or comedy at all, is that I've always been maybe not hateful, but very annoyed by collectivist ideology or groupthink. And when I delved deeper and deeper into this, I saw that almost all societal ills I could see in Sweden came from large government-funded, we call them social engineering programs here. And Sweden has had them for a long time, and we've had them uninterruptedly for a very long time because we were neutral for 250 years. We weren't interrupted by wars. And they were all sort of coalescing towards a point of complete societal destruction. And so I started making jokes about all of this, and then I started publishing my research for the jokes, because at that time I made mostly one-liners. So and the research was, well, extensive. So I started publishing that in podcast form, because podcast as a medium had just sort of appeared out of nowhere. And for some reason, people really enjoyed my podcast. I would say more than they enjoyed my comedy. So I've been on that road ever since. And first I analyzed Sweden for a few years, and then I started looking outwards towards the rest of the West, and saw that we all seem to have the same problems to varying degrees. Now I can see William Smith masturbating with a Nazi flag.
I'm removing them.
Thank you. It was quite distracting.
Yeah. Well, the only laugh he will ever have is to show his shortcomings. So
maybe so. I'm not annoyed, just distracted. So anyway, that's how I got into this, whatever it is I am now.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I think one thing that you mentioned is that there is this socialist, I suppose, not necessarily what would you say, politics, but more of a mentality that is undermining the entire Swedish infrastructure from a political sense. I suppose, correct me if I'm wrong, but I suppose you don't necessarily mean the standard classic socialism of the workers owning the right, the means of productions, but you're more referring to a mentality and a cultural, what would you say, conviction. Would that be fair, or?
I think, yeah, pretty much. What you have is an incorrect idea of economics that you're describing, the socialist idea of economics, and that has devolved into sort of, I guess, what more right-wing people would call cultural Marxism. What you have to understand about Sweden, and Sweden is quite unique in this sense, is that social democracy came early to Sweden. The Social Democrats took over Sweden in 1932, 1 year before Hitler ascended to the throne of Germany, throne in a symbolic sense, that is. They pretty much ruled the country uninterruptedly for the last century, with a few short exceptions. And this has, of course, affected all of culture, all of education, all our institutions. And it's been a very slow march through the institutions, I have to admit. I mean, most of the things that I see the results of in my life here in Sweden actually were political decisions taken before I was even born. So, for instance, that we are a multicultural country was something decided by the Social Democrats in 1975. I was born in 1978. But even before that, you had the takeover of media through public service, which is a very dominant force in Swedish culture, especially before the internet or cable TV, which we got very late.
Yeah.
And you can see this in any area of Swedish public life. And Swedish public life is owned by the state, basically. So universities, schools, daycares, hospitals, and Sweden is a corporatist country in the truest sense of the word, which means that basically the entire country is run through some sort of compromise between big business and unions.
So if I were playing devil's advocate here, I'd say to you, well, Aron, what are you talking about? Sweden, as you said, since 1932 have been sort of hijacked by the Social Democrats with this sort of Marxist cultural mentality. But during that time, Sweden has given the world IKEA and Spotify and H&M and Volvo and Saab and etc., etc. So I suppose what is the discrepancy, or what is the cognitive dissonance that I'm missing here, where Sweden managed to be so successful on the international stage in a capitalistic enterprises, whilst being hijacked by a socialist or Marxist cultural Marxist mentality?
Well, the Social Democrats actually tried to take over business, private business and enterprise in Sweden towards the late 70s and early 80s. But that is the only time that the Swedish populace have gone out and protested en masse. So they had to sort of abandon the idea of nationalizing the free market. And that's, I suppose, where this idea of trying to achieve a socialist utopia through culture, education, and media came like really strong.
Yeah.
And that's been going on ever since. So Sweden is a very innovative country, and the Swedes are a very innovative people. Still, I think we're top 6 innovation countries in the world. But the culture that surrounds this is very much affected by socialist ideas.
Right. And I've had the luxury of living abroad in many different continents and countries over the last 20 odd years or so. And wherever I've gone, when I mentioned that I grew up in Sweden, people are in awe. They have this image of this idyllic society that have managed to crack the code of what works. You've heard yourself, Bernie Sanders, and now Zoran Mandani refer to the Scandinavian model that they want to aspire to. What is it they get wrong?
Well, they don't really understand that Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland and Iceland Sweden especially, were one of the most culturally and ethnically homogenous nations in the world. Before 1975, we had very, very few minorities and very small minorities. I myself am Jewish, and the Jewish minority have been in Sweden for hundreds of years, but it's been very small and very silent. Sweden is also a consensus society. So even though it prides itself when we talk within Sweden, we call ourselves ironically the most individualist country in the world. Very few things could be farther from the truth. I'm not saying we're the most collectivist country in the world, because obviously there are countries like Somalia, but this is a very, for a supposedly Western nation on the edges of the Western Empire, this is a very collectivist country with a very collectivist mindset. As an example, I can tell you that what we introduced, or what the Social Democrats introduced into the culture was when individualism became a topic of discussion in public life. The Social Democrats said, we're not going to have individualism, not of the British or American variety at least. We're going to have our own type of individualism. It's state individualism. So what we have is state individualism. Everyone gets allotted the exact same amount and same type of individualism, which of course is not individualism.
No, it sounds a bit like we're all going to be tall midgets or tall dwarfs. It's a bit of an oxymoron. Okay.
Yes.
And then, okay, you've had this homogeneous society for up to 1975, and then I suppose things start to change. And then you mentioned another key factor in your previous answer where you mentioned the embracing of multiculturalism. What's wrong with multiculturalism? Shouldn't we like to invite other cultures and learn from each other?
Sure, that sounds great. But the problem with multiculturalism, and I mean, this was a policy decision taken in 1975. Sweden still didn't have many immigrants, and the immigrants we had came after the Second World War, when we needed gastarbeiters visiting workforce in our factories. Most of them went home. Some of them stayed and married either from their own ethnicity or culture, or Swedes, and sort of assimilated into the culture. It wasn't a problem. The big problems, I think, started in the late 80s, early 90s, because the problem with multiculturalism is that it is at heart a relativist concept, which means any culture is as good as any other culture. And that is just patently untrue. There are cultures that are better and there are cultures that are worse. But if you adopt this idea, you become, after a while, incapable of distinguishing between better or worse, right or wrong, good or bad, up or down. So that's what happened. And in the late 80s, early 90s, we started taking in a lot of immigrants from North Africa and the Middle East, from troubled countries and troubled cultures, with very low literacy rates and not a lot of schooling. And from a classical sort of socialist idea, every individual in society is just as good as any other individual, and you can sort of exchange them for each other. They're just cogs in a big machinery. Unfortunately, in this case, they tried to exchange 8-tooth cogs with 4-tooth cogs, and it didn't really work. And since Sweden is a big welfare society where it's very easy to go on different types of government subsidies, a lot of these immigrants ended up on subsidies. And this has continued from the early 90s on. And then in 2015, I think we were the country in Europe, when the big immigration crisis happened, that we were the ones that took in most per capita. And since then, we're living in a very, very strange country where most of the population grew up in this old Sweden, or this still has this idea of the old Sweden, where Sweden is one of the most peaceful and high trust societies in the world. At the same time, we have child soldiers in the street killing each other with guns. We have explosions every other week. And bombings, as I guess would be the correct term. I'm sorry if I use explosions. That's what our state media tells us. They say, oh, there was, or if they say it at all, it's like there was an explosion. But of course, it's bombings.
Yeah.
And so I think we have a very high-ranking police official who later killed himself, admitted on state radio a few years ago that we had at least 40 highly organized criminal networks in Sweden that had infiltrated communes, which is a communal level politics, and all the way up to our parliament. So we have that is one of the problems, the high level of organized crime. And then, of course, we have a very high level of Muslim Brotherhood infiltration into Swedish institutions of all kinds, government agencies, political parties, universities, and so on. So we have that. And then by now we have what no one will say, but is effectively ghettos all over Sweden, which we didn't used to have just a few decades ago.
Yeah, it's obviously knowing that, having myself somewhat grown up in one of those ghettos in Bergsjön in Gothenburg, I know of those, but it's almost impossible to convince someone else that who isn't Swedish or never been to Sweden that this is happening. I'm wondering if you can shed some more light on this. So you've mentioned the various gang violence, you've mentioned the bombings and the Muslim Brotherhood infiltrations into Sweden. So we that trend that started accelerating from 2015 when Sweden opened its doors. And I remember it became quite an international news where the prime minister at the time came out and said, "We are going to be the world's moral superpower."
Yes. Right after the Second World War, because Sweden didn't participate in the Second World War, at least not as a belligerent. So we were a non-belligerent Axis power, basically. There's an old joke that says Hitler took Denmark in 2 days, Norway in 2 months, and Sweden with a phone call. Yeah. So Sweden was basically supplying Nazi Germany with ball bearings and iron ore and everything that Germany needed for its war machine. And because of that, we were blacklisted from the American market after the Second World War. So we needed to improve our image, and we decided to become a humanitarian great power. That's what we called ourselves, among ourselves at least, for decades after the Second World War. I grew up in the humanitarian great power of Sweden. And then after a while, I guess we had stockpiled so much moral and ethics that we became a moral superpower. This, of course, is because our leaders by now are buying their own lies. If you read a social democrat like Anna-Greta Leijon, one of our old politicians from the 1980s, a woman, she wrote in her autobiography that, of course, I know that we're not going to take in the entire world. They can't even get here. So it's easy for us to promise that everyone is welcome to Sweden because it is based on the premise that they can't actually come here. Now, at some point from her tenure and later on, they started to believe their own bullshit. And also the world became more integrated and it became much easier to come to Sweden. And we started letting everyone in. As an example, I can tell you that this during Christmas and New Year's, the international phenomena of Somalis in Minnesota. Mm-hmm. Now, the US has between 160 and 180,000 Somalis in a population of 300 plus million people. Sweden has 111,000 Somalis in a population of 10 million people. And we actually had a Swedish female journalist called Isabel Eriksson who made a small Nick Shirley type documentary about the exact same problem among Swedish Somalis as Nick Shirley did about American Somalis. Yeah. Like 4 or 5 years ago now. But it didn't catch fire. No one's talked about it. It was basically a 7-minute small report on YouTube. And it wasn't picked up by any mainstream media, which in Sweden is always state subsidized or state media. So we've had the same problem for at least as long. Now, what's interesting to note is that Minnesota, where the biggest fraud has been detected in America, is actually the American state with the highest number of Swedish descendants. Yeah. From Swedish migration. And the other two places, I think Ohio and California, also very high in absolute numbers Swedish descendants. So, and you see this, you can call it a high trust, naive sort of culture, but also it leans towards the left, doesn't it? So there are certain things that just seems to travel with us.
Yeah. It's one of those things, if you don't laugh, you'll cry kind of a scenario. There's so much to unpack there, but I suppose one thing that I'm very keen to get in with you is this thing you've mentioned a couple of times already, and that's public service. I know that you have a particular disdain for public service, and it's one that I share from a, let's say, Anglophile perspective with the BBC here. Now, I'm very delighted to see how the BBC got internationally exposed in their portrayal of Trump's January 6th speech. But I'm very keen to hear what it is about public service that really gnaws at you.
Well, it's a den of Islamo Marxist vipers mainly. I've also worked at public service, so it's not taken out of thin air. As a young promising comedian, I have worked at Swedish State Radio. I worked at Swedish State Television, where I had some sort of web-based Jon Stewart-like political satire show. I've worked at what we call Utbildningsradion, which is basically TV made for schools, socialist TV shows for school children, shown in classrooms for students. And first of all, I hate it because I worked there, and it was the least creative place I've ever worked. And I became a comedian by forsaking a profitable career in finance as a good Jewish boy, in exchange for being able to say what I want and do creative and fun things with my life. And public service, regardless if it was state radio or this Utbildningsradion or state television, was the exact opposite of that. It's where if you came to Sweden, the public service buildings are right on the outskirts of Stockholm. They are big, brutalist, Soviet-style, East Germany-inspired architecture. It's soul-crushing to work inside those buildings, to say the least. So that annoyed me. And when I worked there, I was a very non-partisan comedian. Even though I have my own politics and what I believe is right and wrong, I make at that time in my career, I saw myself as purely a comedian. I make jokes, nothing else. And if it's funny, it's funny. If it's not funny, fuck it. And so I made jokes about politics, and I noticed that all my jokes aimed against the left were censored, and all my jokes aimed against the right were amplified and encouraged. And this annoyed me immensely, since I don't like censorship, and since I became a comedian just to be able to say what I want. Because when I was a child, I was never able to say what I wanted. My mom always said, no, you can't say that. And so for me, the idea of liberty and freedom and personal responsibility and being an adult is being able to say what I want. It's inextricably in a Freudian way linked with a desire to say what I want. And so partly it comes from that, and partly it comes from the fact that we Swedes finance public service to a tune of $1 billion per year. It has 4,000 employees. I mean, this is comparable to CNN, which reaches 2 billion people a year, and we reach, the Swedish public service reaches a few million in Sweden. I mean, basically everyone can watch it, but everyone does not watch it, obviously. So we give our money to this huge institution, which is so obviously a socialist propaganda and indoctrination machine. So it's like you're being, and you can't choose not to pay because it's taken from your taxes. So basically, you're being forced to pay for your own indoctrination, and it's like being robbed every year, every day of the year. You're being robbed, and you can see your money being used to rub your face in feces, ideological feces that you don't appreciate and which you actually think is harmful, not only to people who are like-minded, but also to people of the left who like what they see, because it completely kills free discussion in Swedish public life, and it skews the entire conversation. So it's impossible to talk about things in a fact-based manner, which is one of the biggest contributing factors, I would say, to Sweden's cultural suicide. Because if you can't discuss things, if you can't talk about things in an unbiased and open-minded way, you will never come to a conclusion that is even an approximation of truth. So, and I remember I was so happy when the BBC got your British BBC. What happened to the BBC there, because I've been trying to tell English friends and colleagues and acquaintances for years that your BBC is actually quite bad. Now, the British media landscape is more fragmented than the Swedish one. It's not as homogenous and consensus seeking, but you could see there was still, supposedly unbiased and impartial, but a leftist propaganda machine. Now that got exposed recently, and I've been trying to tell people, when I tried to tell Brendan O'Neill, whom I appreciate immensely, he just laughed it off. This was many years ago, and said, "No, you're insane. You can't attack the BBC." But I've been going after Swedish public service with vigor now for more than 10 years, and it's one of the most fulfilling missions of my life.
That's a very interesting anecdote, because Brendan on his own podcast had someone on a couple of episodes ago discussing this very idea about BBC's utter corruption and leftist indoctrination mission. So it's very interesting that years ago, when you had that conversation with him, he didn't feel that. So that's interesting to see your predictions, or what you already realized back then, to come to fruition or to realization. I
Well,
suppose you. Sorry, go on.
well, I think government money corrupts. And if you work in media, you want to be free, or at least bound by market forces. If you prop up certain opinions with government money, it becomes very, very hard to defeat those opinions. For instance, I have a podcast. It's just me. I'm financed by my listeners and viewers. And I'm actually, my biggest competition can never go bust. I mean, you can't put public service into Chapter 11 because they're financed by me and and everyone that watches me. So yeah.
Do you see, you mentioned that obviously in the UK, the media landscape is more fragmented, and that's a good thing. Nowhere near good enough, in my opinion. But do you see in Sweden that there is a shift happening? Like, if we talk internationally, more and more people are abandoning the old mainstream media outlets, both on the left and the right. From what I understand, is that yes, CNN have lost 80% of whatever, don't quote me on those numbers, of their viewership, but Fox News has also lost a significant portion, because people are just not consuming news from a TV set anymore. They're going to podcasts, they're going to Substack, they're going on Twitter, or X as it's called now. Do you see any shift like that happening in Sweden? And are you hopeful on that particular point at all?
Well, sure. There's a burgeoning media landscape of alternative media, as it's called. Free media is what I call it in Sweden. But there's still this problem that public service is being financed from our taxes. And the more we scream about this being at least unfair competition, the more money our politicians seem to want to throw at it. And recently, I mean, public service here is feeling the pressure, but what they do is they sort of redirect money. So they say, oh, we're going to make less content in traditional TV because we don't feel we're getting as much money as we want. But they're redirecting a big portion of that money to social media. So they produce now for social media, they produce podcasts. If I go into Podcaster or Apple Podcast in Sweden, the top 3 or 4 shows on those apps are from Swedish state radio.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. And do those journalists who work there, do you think they know they're lying, or do they genuinely believe in the ideas that they promote?
Most of them, I think, are true believers because they go through university, learning to become journalists. And all these universities are owned by the state. And all the teachers are former public service journalists who love public service and teach them about the virtue of public service. And all their literature is Judith Butler and Karl Marx and the like. Well, not Karl Marx. I doubt most of them have even actually seen a copy of Das Kapital. But it's like a buffet of, or a Swedish smorgasbord of postmodern leftist ideology. That's what they get taught. So there's a self-regulating mechanism, and they grew up on public service. I mean, even when I talk to right-leaning people in Sweden, I mean, people who are on the political right and should believe in free market, and I tell them, well, if you believe in free market, then why not for media? Let's, cancel public service. Let's just stop financing it. And they go like, no, but what about Donald Duck at Christmas?
Yeah.
And your viewers might not be aware of this, but
That's...
on Christmas in Sweden, there's a big tradition all over the country to sit down on the couch in front of Swedish state television and watch like an hour of Disney, short Disney films from way back when. Yeah, there's an emotional, sentimental attachment to this huge propaganda instrument. And yeah.
I want to kind of bring the threads together. We've spoken about cultural incompatibility. We've spoken about the crimes and the trends that started significantly increasing from 2015. And we've spoken about, I suppose, political cowardice. And of course, immigration being a significant component of that. I've had a conversation internally with friends and even family members in Sweden discussing how Sweden could let this happen. And primarily when I say this, I meant we're talking about from 2015 onwards. How could Sweden let this happen? And they refuse to accept that it was just out of goodwill, this moral identity that Swedish leaders and the leading class want to portray themselves as. They see this as some sort of almost a conspiracy that you have to be stupid not to realize that if you bring in that many people from completely alien cultures, cultures that are inimical to the Swedish and the Western culture, a child would understand that that is a recipe for disaster. How do you see that? Do you see that it was sheer incompetence? Do you attribute it to Hanlon's razor that don't attribute something to malice that can be explained by incompetence? Or do you think that there was something more behind it? I don't want to invite you to offer any conspiracy theories, but what do you, or do you even think they think it's a problem?
There's been malicious actors involved in this, no doubt. Some of them have been exposed, but most of it is actually attributable to stupidity and arrogance. The Swedish social democratic culture that was fostered in Sweden has been incredibly arrogant. Swedes saw themselves as the best country in the world and think that we're so good that if anyone comes here, they would want to become as Swedish as possible, as fast as possible. They are incapable of seeing that someone might look at the Swedish societies, strive for consensus, timidity, avoidance of conflict, cowardice as despicable qualities, which in some cases and from certain perspectives they are. And also ignorance, because this arrogance fosters ignorance, as do relativism from, the idea of multiculturalism. Any society is as good as our society. So we don't need to integrate them. We don't need to teach them about being Swedish. They will want to adopt. And if they don't want to adopt, that's fine, because any culture is just as good as Swedish culture and they're all equally the same. And this is not logical, but it makes sort of mythological sense if you believe these narratives. Now, there was also a cooperation on paper between a faction of the Social Democratic Party called back then the Social Democratic Christian Brotherhood. And they made a deal with the Muslim Brotherhood. This was back in the 90s. In exchange for votes to integrate the representatives of the Muslim Brotherhood into the political system, into the party. So this was a conscious effort to buy votes. And that, of course, has affected quite a lot. And you can see this alliance between Islamists and socialists very clearly in Sweden, if you know where to look. And some of these characters are malicious. I would say, though, that the Islamists have been much more conscious of what they're doing than the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats have been much more short-sighted. They're like, trading basically political influence for votes. Keeping power, staying in power. You could see it just this summer in Gothenburg, our second largest city. The mayor of Gothenburg, a social democrat called Jonas Attenius, he had held a political speech in front of 10,000 or something praying Muslims in their biggest park there outside. And it was obvious pandering when the war between Israel and Hamas was still ongoing. And as I'm sure you're aware, because England and all of the West has been affected by this war, from the demonstrations and the big immigrant groups that adhere to certain philosophies. And when I say certain philosophies, I mean Islam. There's an interplay. And it's hard to call it a conspiracy. There's been conspiracies within this movement, but I think a lot of it has been driven by faulty ideology and bad ideas.
I had no idea about this alliance between the Muslim Brotherhood and, did you say Christian Brotherhood Alliance?
Yes, now they're called Faith and Solidarity. They changed their name, but yeah. I mean, there's some sort of psychological history here as well, or psychological / ideological history, because the Social Democrats worked with Nazi Germany. And after the war, they sort of swept all of that under the carpet and pretended it had never happened. But in 1974, Olof Palme, then Prime Minister of Sweden, Social Democrat, very famous in his day, was the first Western prime minister who, in his official capacity as prime minister, met Yasser Arafat. And this was in Algiers, and 1 year after the oil crisis hit in 73. So the Western world were sort of paralyzed by lack of oil. So that had some to do with it, but there were other things involved here. Olof Palme and Wilhelm Brandt, who was a West German politician, and Bruno Kreisky, who was the prime minister of Austria, all social democrats, by the way. They were trying to form a third line between the great superpowers of the Cold War. So instead of, belonging to the Soviet sphere or belonging resolutely to the capitalist Americans' sphere of influence, they wanted to forge a third option in world politics. So they aligned themselves with what was called in the UN at the time the non-aligned movement, a movement of third world countries, former colonies of Western powers, who always voted with the Soviet sphere when it came to UN resolutions. So in effect, regardless of what they wanted to accomplish, they ended up in sort of the Soviet sphere more than the Western one. And more than that, what Olof Palme's meeting with Arafat did, because Arafat was at that time known in Western media as a terrorist. And maybe not officially, but unofficially, everyone knew in the security and intelligence that he was a KGB agent. So he opened the door to Arafat, who was at the time Pan-Arabist, but the Pan-Arabist movement morphed into an Islamist movement much later. But this was sort of the first alliance between, or at least official alliance between Western socialists and what later became Islamists. And you also have to remember here that Sweden and Olof Palme, he grew up in a very German-friendly home during the Second World War. He was Swedish upper class. His maternal uncle worked for the Third Reich. He handled the Third Reich's banking system in the Baltic states. And Arafat had just taken over the Palestinian movement, forged it into a Palestinian movement from previously being under the leadership of Haj Amin al-Husseini, Adolf Hitler's mufti. Well, you can't call it a Palestinian Arab because he wasn't really. He was an Arab from what was then the British Mandate of Palestine, who rebelled against the British and led pogroms against Jews way before Hitler came to power. And he had to escape the British Mandate. He escaped to Iraq, where he also managed to annoy the authorities and led pogroms against Iraqi Jews. And then he fled to Italy because Mussolini had funded him. And then onwards to Berlin, where he basically broadcast Nazi propaganda to the Arab world in Arabic. So the Palestinian movement comes from this Nazi heritage. There's traces of that in Swedish social democracy. And with this meeting in Algiers in 1974, there's a sort of rekindling of former Nazi allies, or proxies, or whatever you want to call them, rejoining forces again. And this is also when world opinion is shifting, or at least Western socialist opinion is shifting from a pro-Israel stance to a what becomes Palestinian stance. This meeting that between Arafat and Palme in Algiers, apart from oil and the third line between the superpowers, was right before, a few days, if not the day before, Arafat's famous olive branch in the hand, pistol on the hip speech at the UN. So it gave him gave Arafat a big propaganda victory, where he were able to meet the prime minister of what was then the humanitarian great power of Sweden, Olof Palme, right before his big speech. So there are traces here that you can sort of see. I'm not saying it was conscious, but there's sort of a psychological thing going on here, an ideological, psychological thing of former Nazi allies reconnecting and then, in a sense, opening the door of the West to barbarians.
Wow. Yeah, there's so much there that I didn't know. I mean, I grew up just knowing that Olof Palme was a saint. As someone growing up in the late 80s, early 90s in Sweden, you're you're told Olof Palme was the great saint, and like every saint, he was martyred. But had he not been martyred, it would have been paradise on earth, etc., etc. But obviously, for me, it took having seen the images of him and Castro, whom he vehemently endorsed, to realize that maybe there's more behind the curtain that uh, I wasn't aware of, but I had no idea that the rabbit hole really went that deep. Wow.
It goes quite deep. Olof Palme's mother was very pro-German. She led she was part of a pro-German organization in Sweden during the Second World War. So his upbringing and what he turned out to be after a while, yeah, there's definitely something going on there. Unfortunately, we can't ask Olof Palme. He's martyred, as you say.
Not sure if that's unfortunate, but wow. I suppose to wrap things up, and I realize we've already gone past the time for audience questions. We're already eating into it.
We'll have some. I think it's
I
important.
appreciate it. If anybody does have questions, please raise your hands using the React feature on Zoom. Hopefully, you'll be able to figure it out. But for me, I suppose curious to start wrapping it up from my end by asking, how do you see this play out? And do you believe a solution, whatever the word solution means in this context, is possible? Or do you think that Sweden is doomed?
So here's the thing. I went to Tommy Robinson's march, the flag march in England, in London.
Yeah.
And you can see, because England hasn't been neutral, and they were sort of the part of the winners of the Second World War. So they have a tradition of standing up to tyranny. And I can see the British populace doing that once again, even though things look quite bad at the moment. But Sweden doesn't really have a tradition of that, an historical tradition. We don't have a tradition of revolution in this country. And after 250 years of peace and 100 years of almost uninterrupted social democracy, this is a population who doesn't really, most of it, I think, have a hard time understanding the world and their place in it. So I think Sweden is going to be something quite different within 10 to 20 years. Because the amount of repression needed to fix this situation that we're in Sweden, we have I'm not saying the entire Muslim population of Sweden is Islamist, but they come from a Muslim cultural background, and they now constitute 10 to 11% of the Swedish population. So it's a very, very large minority, and large enough to change the country. And the socialists of Sweden is at least 50% of the population. The Swedish right is social democrats light, because they have handed over the culture to socialists so long ago that it was before I was born. Yeah, so we're in dire straits. And I don't really see, we have the Swedish Democrats, and they have some sort of plan for the future. And they're the second largest party but it's not enough, I'm afraid. And as I said, you'd need high levels of remigration. 200,000 to 300,000 Islamists live in Sweden without a doubt, and all of them need to go. And the rest of the immigrant population needs to be integrated into society. And those things are political faux pas to talk about in Sweden still, especially on the left. On the left still encourages high immigration. They want more immigration. And even though this right-wing government we have at the moment, with the Swedish Democrat as a sort of support party outside of government, they say they've closed down immigration, but we still have immigration for, relatives and friends and acquaintances from way back when, and we take in 100,000 a year, and we migrate maybe we deport maybe 700 or a few thousand in a year. So it doesn't add up. If you look at the fertility numbers, Swedes have a pretty high fertility number per woman in a European context, still too low. It's right about 1.4. The Muslim immigrants have a fertility rate of 1.67 or 1.66 per female. So they still outbirth the majority population. So, and if you look at young people in Sweden, I think 15 to 29-year-olds in Sweden, if you look at just that segment of the population, it's 26.5 to 30% Muslim background. If you look
Can you say those numbers again?
Sure, 15 to 29-year-olds in Sweden, if you look at just that segment of the population, is 26.5 to 30% of the population. Now, they're not all Islamists. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying they come from a Muslim cultural background. And 0 to 30-year-olds, it's like 40%, if you look at that segment. And that's the future of the country. So I don't really see how this is going to change. From a purely statistical analysis of the situation.
Wow. I wasn't aware that
most people aren't. We don't really do that type of statistics here. I had to piece it together through Pew Research and EU statistics.
And if demography is destiny.
Demography is not destiny.
No?
No. You can definitely have a big minority in your country that don't share your values and still prevail if you know what you are and what you believe in. But Swedes don't anymore after 100 years of social democracy and multiculturalism and postmodernism and what have you. They have no idea. It was almost a mantra just a few years ago in Sweden, from left to right, that, I mean, we had a right-wing prime minister, Fredrik Reinfeldt, who said the only true Swedish culture is barbarism.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the left said there's no such thing as Swedish culture. IKEA made commercials where they touted that message. There's no such thing as Swedish culture. And if that's what you brought up to believe, then how are you going to stand against this? And if you wanted to integrate this population, how are you going to integrate them? And into what are you going to integrate them?
It's, I mean, what you're saying is very much aligned with, obviously, the title of this is somewhat borrowed from Douglas Murray's book, The Strange Death of Europe. I'm also reading Jake Wallace-Simon's book, Never Again, question mark, which touches on exactly this, about a society or the Western world who've lost faith and lost belief in themselves and in their own values, that they've made it like all values and all cultures are the same. And that has resulted in this quagmire, to make it, to say it in a very, what would you say, mild way. To put it in a mild way. Wow, I've got a message to say that the hand raising feature doesn't seem to be working. I'm very sorry about that. If you have questions, you can put it in the chat. But I'm a bit shocked to even speak at the moment because I wanted to ask you if there's anything that gives you hope for the future, but it sounds to me like hope is almost foolish to pursue in any way, shape, or form.
Well, I learned in a horror movie a few years ago that the courage is not fighting while there is hope. It's fighting even though there is no hope to be found. I think it was called Legion. Quite a shitty movie, actually.
Okay.
But so if you want to, I mean, what made the West great was freedom of speech, ownership rights, individualism, separation of church and state. These are fairly simple concepts to understand and appreciate, and we can discuss how to apply them. But if there's no discussion and people don't even know that these are the building blocks of the Western culture, then Western culture will disappear.
There's this analogy that I often have in my head where just before there's a natural disaster like a tsunami or an earthquake, the animals sense it before people do, and they sort of run to the safest place. And the same thing happens in a society where uh, when things are going to be inevitably bad, the rich flee societies because they have advanced knowledge through their work or whatever that things are going to hell in a handbasket, and the other group of people that I would say should leave, and I can never believe that I've come to this conviction, are the Jews. I don't think Jews should stay in Britain, and I don't think Jews should stay in Sweden either. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I mean, in Britain, uh, Konstantin Kissins mentioned this, so if it's wrong, blame him, not me. But he said that Britain is the country that is losing the most millionaires than any country on earth except for China. And China is quite understandable why the millionaires there are leaving. But that is a trend that is telling us something about not just the present state, but the future state. And I don't know how it is in Sweden. I know that someone recently is a very famous entrepreneur in Sweden left. I don't remember who exactly. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Do you think the Jewish population in Sweden should stay, or should they do the Aliyah?
Well, Malmö has already almost been emptied of Jews. You can see the same trend in Gothenburg, and this was way before October 7th.
Mm.
Started a long time ago. I mean, Malmö, I call it the Ramallah of the North, Ramalmö. And since October 7th, I can tell you that most Swedish Jews I know at least wake up with that thought every morning. Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do? Because contrary to popular belief, not all Jews are as rich as the Rothschilds, so they can't just pick up and leave to anywhere at any time of their choosing. Me personally, I'm not that rich, unfortunately. I have nothing against wealth. So if you want to give me a lot of money, do that. But I do understand that there will come a time for me where will need to flee. Not move, flee. Because moving is a voluntary thing and fleeing is an involuntary thing. So that's the situation. I mean, as I've been told by my listeners repeatedly, at least you Jews have a place to flee to. Ethnic Swedes have nowhere to go. They only have Sweden.
And on that happy note, yeah, I don't drink alcohol anymore, but after this conversation, I might have to go back to the bottle. You've been tremendously generous with your time, Aron. Where can people find you?
Well, since I do most of my stuff in Swedish, until YouTube builds that translation for Swedish button, I'm on YouTube. I'm in my podcast if you're fluent in Swedish most of the time. And sometimes I write for other alternative publications.
Amazing. And if
Oh,
you were
yeah.
to,
If you're interested in my thoughts about Olof Palme and the Nazi heritage of Sweden and the alliance between the Islamists and socialists, my book, This is a Swedish Tiger, has actually been translated to English and you can buy it on Amazon Kindle.
oh,
Uh,
fantastic.
or my webpage, aronflam.com.
I'll put a link on for it on my Substack when I post this. Thank you very much for sharing that. And the podcast, I'd say it's worth learning Swedish just to listen to that monologue in the beginning of every episode. It's a thing of art. Do you write that monologue down before you record it, or is it off the top of
Yes.
your head? And you do.
I,
Yeah.
I at heart, I'm a writer, not entirely a public speaker. I just got into public speaking via stand-up comedy because that was a way to sell jokes.
Someone, Annika Fagerberg, has asked a question. Annika, I'll ask for you. I think a lot of people think about where should we go and why are the politicians not doing more to stop this insanity, importing strangers? I think we've kind of touched on that, but do you have any further thoughts for Annika?
Well, it would be political suicide. And Sweden is, as I said, and I don't want to insult anyone, but it's a cowardly culture. And it's very hard for Swedes to just say what they want in a straightforward way. They always say it in a passive aggressive way and end every statement with a question mark and preface everything they say by adding, I feel that, instead of saying, I think that, which makes it hard to have an honest, open discussion about things. That, and of course, that we finance public service, and anyone who would say such a thing, that we need really big remigration, is labeled a racist, fascist, Nazi.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, it was a pleasure.
No, the pleasure was all mine and ours. Callum says, thank you very much for your presentation. And I think Callum speaks for all of us. It's been an education, and your generosity is only matched by your brilliance.
And
So,
good
Aron
looks.
Flam. Yeah, and
Thank
good
you so
looks,
much.
indeed. And good looks. You're a
And
gentleman.
yeah, and you take care now. And I hope all your family, friends, and relatives in Iran are safe.
Thank you very much. And next time we do this, we'll do it in person in Stockholm or Tel Aviv or Tehran,
I hope so. From your lips to God's ears.
as they say. All the
Yes.
best, my friend. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening.
Bye.